Okay, we're almost ready to start cutting. There's one more detail, one more technique I want to point out before we get started.
Some leftover plywood from building the sawhorses. Shaved down 1 inch to 20 millimeters. It will be parallel. So now I'll let them dry overnight through the router one more time, and using the top bearing, I'll just open the appropriate blast gates.
So the crown molding in this colonial crown, the cove goes at the bottom, and that's not optional. I've seen it installed upside down plenty of times, but this is how it's designed to go up, and this is the only way that it looks right. So if this is the bottom, this is the top, obviously we have the right and the left. And our list has the cuts on the right and the cut on the left. But if you remember, not only do we have to deal with the spring angle, but we also have to cut with the bottom up. So now that means that the left is on the right and the right is on the left. If you think about that as you're making each cut, there can be a lot of confusion and you can make a lot of mistakes. What I want to be able to do is look at the right side and know that's my right cut, but I want to know that the right is on this side, and that just doesn't feel natural. So what works every time is to quit thinking right and left and just look at, here's the right, this is the right, by putting an R on this side for right and an L on this side for left. So now don't think right and left, just look at this is the right cut and that's the right side. You won't make mistakes that way, and believe me, I've made that mistake many a times when I started cutting crown in the early days and I didn't have some of these techniques. That was one of the biggest issues. So now we've made cutting crown molding a compound cut as simple as cutting base. So we'll get started by cutting our long pieces to our short pieces. Also, the miter stand has the material stocked below and it's oriented in the proper direction. So when I lift up the crown, I have it put on the stand with the bottom in the right direction. So all I have to do is slip it into the saw. Make my measurement, and then I can start the cut. So I've got my dimension of 14 foot 8 3/4 inches, but because it's a cope, and in this case a double cope, I like to cut it a little bit long, and then I'll fit the corners in and I'll spring it in, and that'll push it back really nice and tight to the corners. So I'm going to add a 1/16 of an inch to the overall cut. And that's just kind of an estimate. If I'm doing a piece close to 16 feet, a 1/16 of an inch is not a problem. This is an easy measurement to do. Again, I'm cutting from the back and the bottom, so I can just hook my tape on that longest point that I cut. Pull my measurement, 14 foot 8 3/4. Now before I make my next cut, I'm going to finish up doing the cope on one side. And the reason I do that is if I do have a problem with the cope, if I haven't cut the other side, I can recut a little bit off and do that cope again. But you have to do the measurement before you start the cope, because you'll see the next thing we're going to do is cut off that very tip that we're measuring from. So for this cut, I'm going to swing the saw back to 90, and I'm going to bring the laser right in, and I'm going to just cut right to where the material plumbs out on the bottom of this cove. I'll be cutting that plumb, and that will butt into the other piece. So now to cope, I always do my copes with the top up. So I'll pull it out of the crown stop area and flip it over this way. So rather than moving the material somewhere else, it's convenient. It's held up here. All I had to do is flip it over right on the side. I didn't have to turn it around. And I've got the box that I showed you how to make earlier that'll hold the material in position. And what I want to do is clamp to the miter extension and then clamp the material down. I'm just taking a block, just putting it right on top of the material and clamping that down. And that holds the material nice and tight in the position that it's going to be installed so that I can then make this cut. Now the reason that I'm holding the material up at the angle that it's going to go on is it allows me to see exactly what material to cut away. In the past, I would cut the material flat like this. It would have its miter cut on it, and then I would use a coping saw or this jigsaw that I'm going to use in this case, and then I would have to really tip the saw over to try to cut away enough of the material. This is set up at the angle of installation, so all I need to do is cut it plumb right at the paint line. I don't want to take any of the paint line because that will show. I want to take away the unpainted or the raw wood and leave just a hint of the raw wood. There'll be just a, I call it a color line, but it's actually lack of color. But I'll take the saw blade right up to the paint line, and that will be what I'm going to trace with the jigsaw. So I can cut this plumb. Now I actually will tilt the saw a little more. So this would be plumb, and I'll tip it so that I'm cutting just a little bit more out of the way. But if I was doing it flat and I was trying to cut it and follow from the top, I would have to really lean the saw, and it's a lot more difficult. I used to do it that way, and this is just much simpler. So with this attachment or this foot that I've put on this jigsaw, this is a Collins coping foot. This coping foot, it allows me to always be in contact with the wood. I'm never freehanding out in space. It also allows me a good place to put my hands to do push cuts like that and to do pull cuts, and that's the kind of cuts I'll be doing. So I'm going to let the blade do the work. I'll let it work into the cut or to the paint. I won't be pushing in. I'll just kind of wobble into it, and it'll make a perfect cut every time. And I'm going to have my thumb right on this ridge here, and I'm going to roll it. I'm going to roll it right into the cut. So I've got contact with the material at all times. So now, with the material in the position that it's going to be on the wall, I can just take another piece and just lay that in there and see that my very first cut is an absolutely tight, perfect cut. Just by letting the saw do the work and keeping it just pretty much a 90 but tipped in just a little bit. As long as I'm straight down plumb and not tipping out this way, it's going to fit. This just gives me a little room to roll it back in a little bit. But I have a perfect cope, and now I can go ahead and make the cut on the other side. So I got my piece in for the opposite cope and on the other end, and I've got it all clamped in, but I forgot to square off and cut the tip off. But that's not a problem. I can do that with the jigsaw as well. I prefer to do it on the miter saw, but taking it back and making the cut will take longer. So I'll do it here with the jigsaw. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this in and take it in plumb and just cut that material off so it's perfectly plumb. Another perfect cope. It's a butt on the right, cope on the left. Always want to cut my cope first, finish the cut, make sure it looks good, and then I'll cut the butt. That gives me a second chance if I do mess up a cope. So the cope, looking at this, the butt is on my right, the cope is on my left, but I know I just look down and see the L left, so that means the cope is here. Now before I cut that tip off, I want to get my measurement. So I have my mark, now I can cut that tip off. Now I'll move my coping tools back to the right side of the saw. The rest of my coping will be down there. The only reason I had to move it this one time to this end was because of the double cope. So once I set it up on one end, typically it stays there until all the cuts are done for that room. Okay, so when I have a long piece or any piece where I have a butt cut or a cope on one end and an outside miter on the other, I'll always cut the butt cut or the cope cut first, hook and measure, because outside miters are measured just like copes and butt cuts are measured from the bottom and the back. But in the case of the other cuts, they're measured to the longest point. An outside miter is measured to the shortest point, and it's an angle, so if you cut it first, it's difficult to be able to measure off of that back to your cut. So I always make the other cut, pull the tape, measure, and then I can make the outside miter. But there are situations where I have to do two. In this case, I don't have to, but I want to show you how I deal with that. So I went ahead and cut the outside miter first, and now I need to pull my measurement down to the other end for my butt cut. I have the sub fence on my miter saw, and all I'm going to do is pull the very edge, the very corner, the shortest point of the cut, so it's flush right with that square edge. And now if I needed to do a little short piece, working around a column or doing a short section of wall, it's pretty easy to do. In this case though, I have to do a long cut, 10 foot 11 and 5/16. So I'm going to hook my tape right on the fence of the saw, which lines it up with right where I want it on the trim. And now I'm ready to make my cut. In preparation for the video, I needed a couple of short pieces for demonstration to do some video upstairs. So I cut a couple of chunks off of some of the longer pieces, and I miscalculated. And so what it's left me with is my next to shortest piece is longer than the longest piece I have. So I have a piece for my shortest cut ready to go, and then I have this nice long piece here, but not long enough, and then a couple of shorties. This will give me an opportunity to show you what I do when I need longer material. 16-foot goods is all I can get, and sometimes rooms are a little longer than that, and so I have to splice it together. Rather than just butting it together, so I want to cut an overlapping joint, a scarf joint, and it doesn't really matter what the angle is, about 30 degrees, 22.5, it doesn't matter, it just gives me a nice gluing surface to put it together rather than just butting it in. Now to cut this tall of material on this saw, I'm going to lay the saw over and do it, laid over inside. I'm going to make the mating cut. I don't have to move the saw. That's again why it doesn't really matter what it is. It's going to match up. The next thing I want to do is assemble them before I do the final cuts. And so I want to glue them together. I also want to put a back on them that I will overlap this in behind, and it will fall in that void behind the crown. And what I'll do for that, I'll use a little piece of 1/4 inch ply. I'll make it 3 3/4 inches. And again, that's going to depend on the crown, what fits. You got to remember the wall and the ceiling are coming in at an angle, so if I come out right to that edge, that's going to interfere. This was the material I had, so it's the length that it is. I wouldn't mind if it were a little bit longer. If I were doing a really long, heavy piece, I'd probably want to overlap a good foot on both sides or even more. But this will be fine for this assembly here. So what I'll do first is I'll take the piece that has the undercut, the part that will be covered with the top piece. I'll flip that over, grab some glue, and then just using a little wire staple, I'll put a bunch of staples in this. And obviously I want to make sure I don't go through the front of the trim, but I have a really short staple. But the material does have different thicknesses, so I want to be careful not to get into really thin areas. When you're putting a joint together on this type of material, you want to make sure you glue up both edges, because it'll seal it up for moisture, so you'll get, it'll help reduce or get rid of shrinkage. So I got a nice fit, and I'll just pull it away from the stand so that I can get underneath. Okay, so now I'm going to let this dry up a little bit, and I'll cut my shortest piece, and then I'll come back to this. Normally I'd be doing this on longer pieces. I would know which pieces I need to extend, so I would do those first. So this would actually be one of the first things I'd do. I'd get all my longer pieces assembled and ready to cut, and I'd glue them up and set them aside and let them cure so the glue is good and dry, and then it's acting as one piece of material then. The last thing to do in the shop before we go up and install the crown is to cut the backing material. I grabbed some inexpensive pine material from the lumber yard, 1x4, and what I need to do is cut it down. Remember, it goes on the ceiling. The bed of the saw is the ceiling, and this is the crown that's going to be sticking out. So I basically want it behind the crown, so it'll land back in where the ceiling is here. It'll land back in here. And I'm going to make it a little short. It doesn't need to be tight. I don't want to get into a situation where it might not be perfectly back far enough from forcing the crown out. So I'll leave it about 1/8 of an inch shy of touching the crown, because again, I'm going to be nailing into it, so it's not really there to touch the crown, but just to have solid wood to nail to. So to figure out what I need, I just took a piece of the 1x4. I've put the crown in with the crown stop on, and just put it up to there with the back to what would be the wall, and I just make a little mark. So this is a little piece of scrap, and I'll go ahead and set up the saw and rip this first, and then test fit it. If it works, I'll rip the longer pieces. Okay, so with it fit in position and put this material on what would be the ceiling, I have about 1/8 of an inch of clearance. So I'll rip the material. Now the lengths, I didn't measure for it, but I know that the material sticks out about 3.5 inches, and I know the 3 walls that I need to go on, and so I'll just take the overall length, I'll subtract the 3.5 inches, and you'll see why when we do the install. You need to hold it back from the corners where the butts run in. If I ran it all the way through, then the butts would hit into it. So I'll hold it back probably 4 inches just to be safe. It doesn't need to be tight there.